The spring of 1861 arrived not with a sense of renewal, but with the suffocating weight of an impending, unnatural conflict. As the United States fractured, so too did its most storied institutions. For the United States Marine Corps, a small, tight-knit brotherhood forged in shared hardship and unwavering discipline, the national crisis became an intensely personal one. It was a time of reckoning, a moment when the bonds of camaraderie were tested against the pull of heritage and home, forcing every man to confront a tragic choice between his federal oath and his native state. This was not a war against a foreign adversary, it was a schism that would pit brother against brother, turning a unified corps into two opposing forces destined to meet on the battlefield. The scene at the historic Marine Barracks in Washington, D.C. during the tense days of April 1861 encapsulated this painful divorce. The gray dawn would break over the neat rows of buildings, but the familiar morning rituals of drills and duty were overshadowed by a quiet, somber ceremony of separation. Inside the officers' quarters, a palpable silence reigned, broken only by the rustle of packed belongings and the soft clink of metal. Southern officers, men who had served for years under the stars and stripes, moved with a deliberate, heavy grace. They carefully folded their blue uniforms, their fingers hesitating for a moment before methodically removing the eagle, globe, and anchor insignia of the United States. Each emblem detached was a severing of a sacred vow, a personal surrender of one identity for another. Their northern comrades stood apart, watching the exodus in stunned silence. These were not strangers or mere colleagues, they were men who had shared the same mess hall, endured the same grueling campaigns, and trusted each other with their lives from the shores of Tripoli to the halls of Montezuma. Yesterday, they were brothers in arms, united by a common purpose and an unbreakable code. Today, they were becoming enemies. There was no shouting, no grand recrimination, only the profound and awkward sorrow of an irrevocable parting. As one of the departing Southern officers paused in the doorway, his bags in hand, he turned to face the men he was leaving behind. His gaze swept over their familiar faces before he uttered the chilling prophecy that would define the next 4 years: "We'll see you on the battlefield, gentlemen." The scale of this schism was devastating for a corps that prided itself on its cohesion and familial bonds. Out of a total strength of approximately 1,892 officers and enlisted men, the U.S. Marine Corps was about to suffer a crippling hemorrhage of its leadership and experience. While the institution as a whole remained steadfastly loyal to the Union, it lost a significant and disproportionate segment of its most seasoned commanders. At least 16 commissioned officers, nearly half of the line officers on the active list, resigned their posts to offer their swords to the nascent Confederacy. They were followed by more than 100 enlisted men, veteran non-commissioned officers and privates who felt their allegiance lay with the South. The division was drawn almost exclusively along regional lines. For the Southern Marines, the concept of loyalty was not an abstract devotion to a federal government in Washington, but a deeply ingrained duty to the soil of their birth, to Virginia, to the Carolinas, to Georgia. They saw themselves as defending their homes and their way of life, an obligation that, in their minds, superseded any oath sworn to a union they believed had been broken. Yet, this decision was rarely simple or swift. A little-known fact of this painful period is the profound internal conflict that plagued many of these departing officers. For weeks, they found themselves torn between two irreconcilable duties. They were caught in a gut-wrenching tug-of-war between their solemn, sworn oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States and the powerful, emotional pull of family, friends, and state. Letters from home pleaded with them to return, while their military honor demanded they stay. This was a private agony, played out in quiet quarters and sleepless nights, that ultimately forced them to choose a side in a conflict they never wanted, ensuring that the first casualties of the war for the Marine Corps were the bonds of brotherhood itself. Long before the nation's fault lines cracked wide open, a dramatic and violent episode unfolded that, in hindsight, served as a haunting prologue to the coming storm. 2 years before the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, the U.S. Marine Corps was called upon to quell a domestic insurrection that captured the attention of the entire country. In October 1859, at Harpers Ferry, Virginia, Marines engaged in what would unknowingly be their final significant joint operation before the Corps was torn asunder. It was here, in a desperate firefight against a fervent abolitionist, that men who would soon choose opposing flags fought shoulder to shoulder, a band of brothers united in purpose one last time. The operation was overseen by an Army colonel named Robert E. Lee, a man whose own destiny would soon become inextricably linked with the cause of the South. The scene was set on a cold, crisp October dawn. A thick mist rolled off the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, shrouding the small town in an eerie silence. Inside the Federal Armory, the fanatical abolitionist John Brown and his small band of followers had barricaded themselves inside the sturdy brick fire engine house, holding several hostages. They had come to spark a slave rebellion that they hoped would spread like wildfire across the South. Instead, their raid had stalled, and now they were cornered. A detachment of 90 Marines, dispatched hastily from the Washington barracks under the command of First Lieutenant Israel Green, had arrived to end the standoff. For them, it was a straightforward mission: restore federal authority and capture the insurgents, dead or alive. As the first light of day streaked the sky, the assault began. The Marines, acting with disciplined precision, advanced on the engine house. Finding the doors barred and heavily reinforced, they repurposed a massive ladder as a battering ram. With rhythmic grunts, a team of Marines slammed the heavy ladder against the wooden doors again and again, the splintering cracks echoing like gunshots in the tense morning air. Finally, with a great groan, the entrance gave way. The moment the breach was made, Lieutenant Green, embodying the Corps' spirit of leading from the front, was the first man to burst through the splintered opening, his dress sword held high. Inside the darkened, smoke-filled structure, chaos erupted. John Brown, a wild, messianic figure with a flowing beard and burning eyes, turned to face the intruders. He raised his carbine and fired at the charging officer, but in the dim light and confusion, the shot went wide. Before Brown could reload or his men could mount an effective defense, Green was upon him. Having forgotten his regulation sword in his haste to depart Washington, Green was carrying a lighter, ceremonial dress sword, a weapon ill-suited for the brutal reality of combat. He lunged forward, thrusting the blade at Brown. The sword, not designed for piercing, struck a belt buckle or bone and bent, failing to inflict a mortal wound. Undeterred, Green reversed his grip and brought the hilt of the sword down on Brown's head again and again, striking the abolitionist to the ground, where he was quickly subdued. The raid was over. Lieutenant Green had personally captured the most famous and feared anti-slavery crusader in America. The capture of John Brown was hailed as a swift and decisive victory, a testament to the professionalism of the Marine Corps. Yet, history would reveal a profound and bitter irony in this shared triumph. The very men who stood united at Harpers Ferry that day, who had faced down Brown's fire together, were standing on the precipice of a cataclysm. Within 2 short years, the national unity they had fought to uphold would shatter. Some of the very Marines who took part in that raid would soon don the blue uniform of the Union, fighting in a war that would ultimately achieve Brown's goal of emancipation. Others, following their states out of the Union, would put on the Confederate gray, fighting to preserve the very institution of slavery that Brown had given his life to destroy. The last fight they shared as brothers was, in reality, the opening scene of a war that would force them to become enemies. As the Union dissolved, the newly formed Confederacy moved quickly to build the institutions of a sovereign nation, including its own military. On March 16, 1861, the Confederate Congress, meeting in its provisional capital, passed the act that officially established the Confederate States Marine Corps, CSMC. For the Southern officers and men who had resigned their commissions from the U.S. Marine Corps, this was the moment their new allegiance was formalized. A new corps was born, destined to fight its own progenitor. The CSMC was, by necessity and design, built upon the foundation of its northern counterpart. Its structure, drills, and regulations were largely copied from the familiar U.S. Marine Corps model. The men who organized it knew no other way. Yet, from its inception, the CSMC sought to forge its own distinct identity. Substantive changes were made to distinguish it from the Yankee Corps it had broken away from. The traditional fife, whose shrill notes had accompanied generations of American Marines, was replaced by the light infantry bugle, altering the very soundscape of its daily drills. Its organizational structure was also modernized, establishing permanent companies rather than the temporary detachments often formed for specific duties in the old Corps. Subtle but significant alterations were made to the uniform, incorporating British-inspired elements. Most symbolically, the familiar Federal blue was cast aside in favor of gray jackets, adorned with 9 gold buttons, a stark visual declaration of their new loyalty. The Confederacy now had its Marines. The nerve center for this fledgling corps was established in the bustling new capital of Richmond, Virginia. Not far from the city, on the strategic bluffs overlooking the James River, a primary training facility was established. Known as Camp Beale at Drury's Bluff, this encampment would become the crucible where farmers, clerks, and former U.S. Marines were forged into a cohesive fighting force for the Southern cause. It was on the parade grounds of Camp Beale, during the hopeful spring of 1861, that the abstract idea of a Confederate Marine Corps became a living reality. A line of new recruits stood awkwardly under the Virginia sun, the air thick with the smell of pine and the tension of impending war. For the first time, they were ordered to don their new gray uniforms. As the men shrugged on the coarse wool jackets, a sense of profound change settled over them. An instructor, his face weathered from years of service at sea and ashore, walked down the line, his voice sharp and familiar. He was a former sergeant in the United States Marine Corps, a man whose commands had echoed across the decks of federal warships and the grounds of the Washington barracks. He barked out the same orders he had always given, his accent and cadence unchanged. Attention! Shoulder arms! The movements were the same, the discipline demanded was identical. For a moment, a recruit might close his eyes and imagine he was back in his former life, a U.S. Marine in service to the country of his birth. But when he opened them, the reality was starkly different. The flag flying overhead was not the stars and stripes, but the stars and bars. And the enemy, the target of all this training and discipline, was no longer a foreign power, but the very men with whom he had once shared a uniform and a brotherhood. It was all the same, yet everything had changed. The man who was his brother yesterday was now his sworn foe. Despite this sense of purpose, the CSMC was plagued by chronic institutional weaknesses from its very first day. The Corps constantly struggled with understaffing. With a burgeoning Confederate Army offering better pay, recruitment for the Marines was difficult. The allure of serving in the prestigious infantry or cavalry often overshadowed the call of the sea service. To fill its ranks, the CSMC command was forced to offer enlistment bounties, cash premiums to entice men to sign on. When that proved insufficient, they had to rely on conscripts drafted into the army, men who were then transferred, often against their will, to serve as Marines. This created a force with deep internal divisions, but one held together by a cadre of dedicated officers, many of whom harbored a naive optimism about the conflict ahead. A persistent rumor circulated among the Southern officers in those early days: the war would be a swift, decisive affair. They spoke confidently of a victory that would see them all returning to their peacetime lives, triumphant and home for good, by Christmas of 1861. It was a dream that would soon be shattered by the brutal reality of a long and bloody war. The theoretical war of words, oaths, and divided loyalties met its brutal, chaotic reality on July 21, 1861. On the sweltering fields near Manassas, Virginia, a battalion of United States Marines was committed to the first major land battle of the Civil War. For these men, the first Battle of Bull Run was to be their baptism by fire, the first time they would face their countrymen in open combat. It was a debut that would end not in glory, but in a catastrophic failure that would haunt the Corps for years to come. From the outset, the experience was profoundly disorienting. As the battle lines clashed, the Marines were confronted with the surreal horror of a fratricidal war. The enemy charging toward them was not a foreign foe speaking an alien tongue. They were Americans. The commands shouted by Confederate officers across the smoke-filled fields were the same drills and maneuvers taught at West Point and practiced in garrisons across the former United States. This was not war as they had ever known it, it was a violent, bloody dispute between family, and the psychological toll was immediate and devastating. As the tide of battle turned against the raw Union Army, discipline evaporated. A wave of panic swept through the Federal ranks, and the Marine Battalion, expected to be a steady anchor of professionals amidst an army of volunteers, was caught in the maelstrom. In a shocking breakdown of order, a significant portion of the Marine detachment broke and fled in a disorganized rout. This moment of panic-stricken flight became an indelible stain on the Corps' proud reputation, a deep source of institutional shame that was deliberately downplayed or omitted from official records for a long time. Yet, even within the disaster, there were acts of resolute courage. The battalion commander, Major Jacob Zeilen, refused to yield to the chaos. As his men streamed past him in retreat, Zeilin physically stood in their path, using the flat of his sword and the force of his authority to halt the fleeing Marines. He managed to rally a portion of his command and, against overwhelming odds, organized 2 desperate counterattacks to try and reclaim their lost position. Both attempts were valiant but ultimately futile, swallowed by the Confederate advance. Amid the carnage, the Corps suffered its first significant loss of leadership. Second Lieutenant Robert Hitchcock was struck down, earning the grim distinction of being the first Union Marine officer killed in the Civil War. The true cost of the battle, however, was not measured in lost ground or even lost lives, but in the moral devastation inflicted upon the individual Marine. The horror of that day was perfectly captured in countless, unrecorded moments of personal agony. One can easily picture the scene: a hot, suffocating July afternoon, the air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the deafening roar of cannons. A young Marine, his face streaked with sweat and grime, kneels in the firing line, taking aim at a line of advancing Confederates. Through the swirling smoke, he catches a glimpse of a familiar face in the gray ranks, a man he had shared a drink with, stood guard duty with, a former brother in arms. For a split second, his finger freezes on the trigger. The entire purpose of his life up to that point had been to stand with that man, not against him. "Shoot, you fool!" a sergeant roars beside him, shattering the moment of hesitation. A flash, a kick of the rifle against his shoulder. The figure in gray crumples to the ground. The Marine stares, drops his weapon, and a raw, guttural scream tears from his throat, a sound of grief and self-loathing lost in the din of war. In the aftermath, the shame of Bull Run was felt deeply by the survivors. A little-known fact is that some of the very men who had fled demanded to be sent immediately back to the front lines, desperate for a chance to wash away the disgrace with blood. But the command refused their request. The damage had been done. The reputation of the U.S. Marine Corps had been severely undermined, and it would take years of hard fighting and sacrifice to redeem the honor that was lost on that bloody Virginia field. Following the disastrous debut at Bull Run, the primary role of the United States Marine Corps shifted decisively from large-scale land engagements back to its traditional domain, the sea. For the next 2 years, the war for the Union Marine was not one of massive armies clashing in the fields of Virginia or Pennsylvania, but a grueling, relentless campaign fought from the decks of warships and the confines of small landing craft. Their central mission became the enforcement of the Union's naval blockade of the South, the so-called Anaconda Plan, designed to strangle the Confederacy by cutting off its overseas trade. This vast undertaking required the Marines to serve as the Navy's amphibious infantry, participating in countless coastal raids and expeditions to seize control of the Confederate coastline, piece by painful piece. Life for a Marine during this period was a constant cycle of monotonous sea duty punctuated by moments of intense, violent action. They served as the disciplined garrisons aboard the ships of the blockading squadrons, maintaining order and manning the guns during naval engagements. But their most critical function was to go ashore. Throughout 1861 and 1863, Marines were the tip of the spear in a series of daring amphibious operations. They swarmed from their boats to storm isolated Confederate lighthouses, seize critical signal stations, and capture vital coastal forts. They landed on remote islands to establish coaling stations and supply depots for the Union fleet, holding these small but strategic footholds against Confederate counterattacks. In 1862, their role was instrumental in the successful campaign to capture New Orleans and Baton Rouge. This pivotal victory effectively severed the Confederacy along the Mississippi River, a crippling blow to the Southern war effort. It is crucial to understand the scale on which the Marines operated. For the entirety of the war, the Union Marine Corps consisted of just a single battalion. This was a minuscule formation when compared to the hundreds of thousands of soldiers serving in the Union Army. Yet, this small, highly disciplined force was engaged up and down the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. Their battle honors from this period include participation in the brutal and often costly assaults on key Confederate strongholds like Fort Wagner, Fort Sumter, Fort Fisher, and Gregory Point. A little-known aspect of these coastal operations was the frequent collaboration between Marine detachments and newly formed regiments of black soldiers. These joint missions, born of tactical necessity, added a complex layer to the conflict. For the Southern defenders peering from their earthworks, the sight of former slaves fighting alongside U.S. Marines in blue uniforms was a potent symbol of the social revolution the war had become, undoubtedly adding a particular fury and tension to these coastal skirmishes. The nature of this war was best captured in the small, unrecorded moments of dread and violence that defined the amphibious raids. Imagine the scene on the deck of a blockading vessel off the Carolina coast on a moonless night in 1862. A detachment of Marines, their faces darkened with charcoal, makes final preparations for a landing. Their target is a Confederate-held lighthouse on a nearby island, a beacon guiding blockade runners through the Union fleet. The only sounds are muffled whispers, the scrape of bayonets being fixed to rifles, and the gentle lapping of water against the hull. They slip over the side and into the longboats, the rhythmic splash of the oars muffled by cloth. The boats glide silently through the black water toward the dark shoreline. Suddenly, the stillness is shattered. A single muzzle flashes from the shore, the crack of the rifle shot echoing across the water. They knew, someone screams in a choked whisper. In an instant, the beach erupts with gunfire. The element of surprise is gone. The boats now race toward the shore under a hail of accurately aimed bullets, the water around them churned by enemy fire. The Southerners holding the island are not militia, they are professionals, fighting with a skill and determination that matches that of the attackers. For the Marines in the boats, the terrifying realization dawns, the men they are trying to kill are just as good as they are. They are their mirror image, now seen only through the sights of a rifle. While the Union Marine Corps was fighting its war along the coastal periphery, the Confederate States Marine Corps was forging its own distinct and contradictory legacy. Within the Confederate military, the CSMC quickly cultivated a reputation as an elite, disciplined force, particularly among the naval crews with whom they served. They were the professional soldiers of the Southern Fleet, prized for their steadfastness and marksmanship in the heat of battle. This reputation was cemented in two of the most iconic engagements of the war, the stubborn defense of Drury's Bluff and the revolutionary naval clash at Hampton Roads. The defense of Drury's Bluff on the James River became the CSMC's finest hour. Positioned at this critical fortification guarding the water approach to Richmond, Confederate Marines played a pivotal role in repelling a powerful Union naval squadron. Their disciplined artillery and rifle fire from the bluffs proved decisive, halting the Union advance and saving the Confederate capital. It was a stunning victory against a superior force, earning the Corps widespread acclaim. Months earlier, Confederate Marines had been central participants in a battle that would change naval warfare forever. They were aboard the formidable ironclad CSS Virginia, the vessel ingeniously rebuilt from the scuttled hull of the former USS Merrimack, when it steamed into Hampton Roads in March 1862. During the historic duel with the Union's own ironclad, the USS Monitor Dash, the Marines aboard the Virginia directed a continuous fire against their strange, new adversary, cementing their place in naval history. However, this elite status was a fragile veneer that concealed deep-seated institutional problems. The very prestige of the Corps was constantly undermined by chronic manpower shortages, low pay, and the questionable methods required to fill its ranks. A critical and little-known fact is that a Confederate Marine's salary was lower than that of an Army soldier of the same rank. This pay disparity created a constant drain of potential recruits, with able-bodied men preferring the better compensated and often more glorified life in the infantry or cavalry. The CSMC was simply not a competitive career choice. This forced the command to resort to offering enlistment bounties, essentially paying a premium to persuade men to join. When even that failed, the Corps had to rely on Army conscripts, men who were drafted and then assigned to the Marines, often with little desire to be there. This reliance on draftees created a significant internal rift. A persistent rumor circulated that the veteran Confederate Marines, who had joined the Corps out of loyalty and a sense of duty, held the conscripts in open contempt. They were seen as unworthy of the uniform, men who lacked the genuine esprit de corps that defined a true Marine. This created a force that was elite in performance but fractured and resentful in its composition. The experience of a Confederate Marine during this era was a study in contrasts, a warrior in a revolutionary new age of warfare, yet part of a struggling, underappreciated institution. Picture a Marine standing on the grated iron deck of the CSS Virginia in March 1862. The air is thick with the sulphurous stench of cannon smoke. Through the haze, he watches the bizarre Union vessel, the USS Monitor Dash, approach. It looks like nothing he has ever seen, a floating cheesebox on a raft. With a wry grin, he remarks to his comrade, "Strange contraption," as he methodically loads his musket, preparing to pick off any Yankee foolish enough to expose himself. An hour later, the world has been turned upside down. The grin is gone, replaced by grim determination. Cannonballs fired from his own ship, which had splintered wooden frigates the day before, now simply bounce off the Monitor's iron hull with a deafening clang. His musket is useless against the armored turret. He is witnessing the violent death of an entire era of naval combat. The age of sail and wooden ships is vanishing before his eyes, and in that moment, he might feel that the traditional role of the Marine, the sharpshooter in the rigging, the master of the boarding party, is dying along with it. 3 years after the humiliating retreat at Bull Run, the United States Marine Corps would finally and definitively reclaim its honor in the fiery crucible of one of the war's most decisive naval battles. In the sweltering heat of August 1864, a powerful Union fleet under the command of Admiral David Farragut steamed towards the mouth of Mobile Bay, Alabama, one of the last major Confederate ports still open to blockade runners. It was here, aboard Farragut's flagship, the USS Hartford that a small detachment of U.S. Marines would deliver a performance of such spectacular skill and bravery that it would forever erase the stain of their earlier failures. The approach to the bay was a death trap. The channel was heavily mined with Confederate torpedoes, as naval mines were then called, and protected by the formidable cannons of Fort Morgan. As the Union fleet pushed forward, the lead ship, the USS Tecumseh struck a torpedo and sank in seconds, taking most of its crew with it. The entire Union advance faltered, the ships hesitating at the edge of the minefield under the punishing fire from the fort. It was in this moment of crisis that Farragut, lashed to the rigging of the Hartford, to get a better view above the smoke, made his legendary decision. When warned of the mines, he bellowed his immortal command, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." It was a call for absolute resolve, and the Marines aboard his flagship answered it with deadly fire. Positioned high above the chaos of the main deck, they had taken up precarious posts on the fighting tops, small platforms on the ship's masts. From this vantage point, they had a clear view of the enemy ships and forts, but they were also completely exposed, easy targets for Confederate sharpshooters. As the Hartford and the rest of the fleet steamed boldly through the minefield and into the bay, it was the exceptional marksmanship of these Marines that helped suppress the enemy crews. Imagine the scene high on the mainmast of the Hartford. A Marine braces himself against the swaying pole, the deck pitching violently below him. His world is a vortex of deafening cannon blasts, splintering wood, and the screams of men. His hands, slick with sweat, grip his musket tightly. Through the dense smoke, he spots his target, a Confederate officer on the deck of the formidable ironclad CSS Tennessee. He takes a breath, times the rock of the ship, and aims. The musket kicks hard against his shoulder. Through the smoke, he sees the officer fall. A triumphant shout comes from his comrade beside him, "You got him." But there is no time to celebrate. The battle rages on. Another target is already in his sights. For 7 relentless hours, this deadly work continued. Every shot fired by the Marines was a calculated, lethal strike, delivered under the most intense pressure imaginable. Their contribution did not go unnoticed. In the aftermath of the resounding Union victory, the bravery of the Marines on the Hartford was singled out for special praise. In an unprecedented act of recognition for a single engagement, 8 of the Marines who had fought that day were awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor. It was the rarest of honors in the history of the Corps. A powerful testament to their decisive impact on the battle. More than just a victory, the Battle of Mobile Bay was a moment of profound and complete rehabilitation for the United States Marine Corps. The courage, discipline, and lethal professionalism displayed high in the rigging of the Hartford had finally and forever redeemed the honor that had been lost on the chaotic fields of Bull Run. By the spring of 1865, the fate of the Confederacy was sealed. For years of brutal, bloody conflict had exhausted the South, and its military institutions began to crumble one by one. For the Confederate States Marine Corps, an organization that had fought with distinction from the ironclad decks of the CSS Virginia to the defensive bluffs of the James River, the end came not with a final, glorious battle, but with the quiet, somber acceptance of defeat. In April 1865, just before the complete capitulation of all Southern armies, the CSMC effectively ceased to exist. The cost of its 4-year struggle had been immense for such a small and perpetually understaffed corps. A total of 460 Confederate Marines were lost during the war. Of these, 148 were killed in combat, a testament to their presence in the war's fierce naval and coastal engagements. Yet, far more, 312 men, succumbed to disease, exposure, and other non-combat causes, a grim reflection of the harsh conditions and logistical failures that plagued the Southern war effort. These losses represented a staggering percentage of the Corps' total strength, bleeding the small organization of its veteran corps over years of attrition. In its final days, the last organized detachments laid down their weapons without a fight, recognizing the utter futility of any further resistance. The final act of this drama played out on the streets of a defeated Richmond in April 1865. The scene was a quiet, solemn ritual of defeat. The last remaining Confederate Marines, their gray uniforms tattered and worn, formed up one final time. Before them stood a Union officer, his own face weary from the long war. There was no defiance, no grand speeches, only the heavy silence of an ending. The Marines methodically stacked their rifles, the clatter of wood and steel echoing the finality of the moment. In the ranks of the Union soldiers overseeing the surrender, a man's gaze fixed upon one of the capitulating Confederate sergeants. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. For years of grime, beard, and hardship could not completely erase the familiar features of an old friend. He stepped forward. "Joe?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The Confederate sergeant looked up, his eyes meeting his former comrades. "Sam," he acknowledged, his voice flat with exhaustion. A profound, awkward silence fell between them, a chasm of smoke, blood, and conflicting loyalties that 4 years of war had carved. What could possibly be said to the man you had been trying to kill, the man who had been trying to kill you? Finally, the Union soldier broke the silence with the simple, unassailable truth. "The war is over." The Confederate Marine nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "Yes," he replied. "It's over." For many of the surviving Confederate Marines, the surrender of their arms was not the end of their defiance. Unwilling to live in a reunited country under the government they had fought so fiercely against, a significant number chose a life of self-imposed exile. They packed what little they had and journeyed south, finding new homes in Mexico or Brazil, determined to never again live under the stars and stripes. Yet, even in defeat and dispersal, the bonds forged in the old corps before the war were not entirely extinguished. A little-known fact of the post-war era is that some former officers of the CSMC held clandestine meetings with their old U.S. Marine comrades. These were quiet, private affairs, never spoken of publicly. In the shared silence of a back room or a secluded porch, men who had been enemies found a way to reconnect, acknowledging a shared history that transcended the banners under which they had fought. But these were exceptions, fragile, unspoken truces in a nation still nursing its deep wounds. The Brotherhood had been shattered, and for most, it could never be made whole again. When the cannons finally fell silent and the last battle flags were furled, the United States Marine Corps emerged from the Civil War intact, yet profoundly scarred. In purely numerical terms, its losses were relatively light when compared to the catastrophic casualties suffered by the massive volunteer armies of the Union. But the true cost of the war for the Corps could not be measured in muster rolls or casualty lists. The deepest wound was not physical but psychological, a spiritual trauma inflicted by the schism that had turned its own ranks against each other. For 4 years, brothers had aimed their rifles at brothers. Men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder as a symbol of national unity had met as mortal enemies on the battlefield. After the war, the institution faced the long and difficult task of rebuilding not just its numbers, but its very soul and reputation. The memory of the Civil War would endure as the most painful and intimate chapter in the history of the Marine Corps. The conflict served as a harsh lesson, underscoring the inherent limitations of the Marine Corps' role in a massive, continental land war. While Marines fought with distinction in coastal raids, amphibious landings, and from the decks of naval vessels, the war's decisive battles were won and lost by the sprawling armies of Grant and Lee. It was the infantryman, not the sea soldier, who ultimately decided the nation's fate at Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Appomattox. The war had proven that while the Corps was an indispensable amphibious force, it was not structured or equipped to be a primary actor in a major land-based conflict. More than anything, The agonizing split within the Corps served as a perfect microcosm of the division that had torn the nation apart. The crisis forced every Marine of Southern birth into an impossible choice, a crucible that tested the very definition of loyalty. Was a man's highest duty to his state and his family, or to the federal government to which he had sworn a solemn oath? This conflict between personal allegiance and national obligation was the central question of the war, and for the Marines, it was not an abstract political debate but a deeply personal tragedy that severed lifelong friendships and turned comrades into adversaries. The depth of this wound is revealed in a telling, little-known fact from the post-war years. While veterans of the Union and Confederate armies eventually began to hold joint reunions, seeking reconciliation in shared memories of battlefield courage, the veterans of the USMC and the CSMC never did. There were no combined encampments where old men in blue and gray could stand together, no shared memorials to their fallen. The schism within the Corps was too personal, the sense of betrayal too profound. The Brotherhood had been broken in a way that, for the institution and its members, was seemingly beyond repair. Perhaps the truest picture of the war's aftermath for the Marines can be found not in official histories, but in the quiet, unrecorded moments of the decades that followed. Imagine a small town somewhere in the South in the 1880s. The heat of the day has faded, and two old men sit together in weathered chairs on a porch, the evening light softening the lines on their faces. One wears a faded, sweat-stained blue kepi, the other a gray one of the same style, the last vestiges of the uniforms that once defined them. They sit in a comfortable silence, puffing on their pipes, watching the world go by. After a long while, the man in the blue cap speaks, his voice a low rumble. "Remember Bull Run?" The man in the gray cap nods slowly, taking the pipe from his mouth. "I remember." Silence descends again, thick with all the things that do not need to be said. The smoke from their pipes curls into the twilight air, mingling and disappearing. Some wounds never truly heal. Some divides can never be fully bridged. But here, on this quiet porch, two former enemies could at least sit side by side and share the heavy weight of their memories, silent brothers once more in a peace that had cost them everything.